Chapter 1. My name is Bryn, and my job is to fight beige. I am a soldier in the war against greige, a crusader for color, and a professional vanquisher of gloom. I have hung curtains in crumbling Victorians, retiled bathrooms in houses where the plumbing predated democracy, and once convinced a 90-year-old woman that mauve was not, in fact, a personality trait. I am good at what I do. I am, in fact, excellent at what I do. My current client, however, is testing the absolute limits of my professional optimism. The contract was for a simple, if large-scale, residential remodel. The client, a Mr. G. Blackwood. The property, Blackwood Manor. The pay, enough to make me think Mr. Blackwood might be quietly printing his own money. The catch? The catch was that Mr. Blackwood was actually King Gideon, the alpha king of all shifters in a 500-mile radius. Blackwood Manor was a Gothic monstrosity that had been actively fermenting in its own misery for 1,000 years. And the decorating committee was every wolf in the building, all of whom believed that the pinnacle of interior design was a damp cave with good acoustics. Later, much later, Marcus, the king's beta, would tell me what happened the moment I walked into the throne room. His wolf recognized you, he'd said, with the weary honesty of a man who had been cleaning up after this particular disaster for weeks, and immediately tripped over his own paws. But that was later. At the time, I didn't know what a wolf recognizing someone meant, or that it could rearrange a king's entire personality in under a second. I just knew shifters the way everyone knew shifters. They'd been part of the world since before I was born. Neighbors, co-workers, the guy at the coffee shop whose eyes occasionally caught the light wrong. Shifters weren't a secret. They were just people who also happened to be wolves, which mostly meant they ate too much, ran hot, and had opinions about personal space that could charitably be described as intense. What I did not know was that shifter kings lived in actual castles, or that those castles could be this ugly. Now, the aforementioned Alpha King, a man whose resting face was brooding storm cloud, was currently standing in his great hall, holding a swatch of fabric I'd picked out for the morning room, and defending its honor with the gravity of a man declaring war. While I appreciate the pack's dedication to the color of dignified shadow, he said, his voice a low rumble that I could feel in the soles of my boots, I believe Sun-Kissed Lemon offers a more proactive approach to the general well-being of this household. A massive wolf in the back, one of the guards, still in fur because apparently that was just a thing people did around here, tilted his head so far sideways he nearly fell over. I was just trying to hang some new curtains. This was not in my brochure. The first sign that this job was going to be unusual was the driveway, which was less a driveway and more a solemn, 2-mile-long procession toward inevitable doom. The GPS had given up a mile back, simply displaying a flickering skull icon and the words, "Turn back." I, however, had a contract and a non-refundable deposit, so I pressed on, my cheerful yellow Fiat looking increasingly ridiculous against the backdrop of gnarled, skeletal trees. Blackwood Manor didn't loom. That was too active a word. It squatted. It sulked. It was a gargantuan pile of gray stone that looked like it had been designed by a committee of depressed gargoyles. If a thunderstorm and a migraine had a baby, and that baby was a castle, this would be it. A man was waiting for me on the ridiculously oversized stone steps. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the weary expression of someone who had spent his entire adult life managing someone else's catastrophic personality. He smelled faintly of coffee and exhaustion. I don't have a shifter's nose, but some things transcend species. "Bryn Larson?" he asked. His voice was a pleasant baritone, but laced with the kind of fatigue only found in high-level customer service or middle management. "Marcus, I'm the king's beta." "Nice to meet you," I said, extending a hand. He shook it, his grip firm and carefully calibrated, the way shifters always shook hands with humans, like they were trying very hard not to accidentally crush anything. "The king is eager to meet you." The word eager was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. He sounded about as eager as one is for a root canal. Marcus led me inside. If I thought the outside was gloomy, the inside was a masterclass in light repellent design. The grand entryway was so dark I was surprised I didn't trip over a sleeping bear. A single dusty shaft of light struggled through a high, grimy window, illuminating a tapestry that depicted what looked like a very sad wolf losing a fight with a very large goat. "Charming," I muttered, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. Marcus shot me a look that was 1 part amusement, 2 parts apology. "It's a work in progress. Has been for about 900 years. As we walked, I noticed the smell. Every building has one. A new apartment smells like paint and potential. A lived-in family home smells like laundry and coffee and yesterday's dinner. Blackwood Manor smelled like damp stone, old leather, and something wild underneath. A warm animal musk that wasn't unpleasant, but was deeply, unmistakably not human. It smelled like a place where wolves lived. It smelled like a den that had been dressed up in a suit. My job, I was quickly realizing, was less interior decorator and more architectural exorcist. I was here to cast out the spirits of bad taste. I followed Marcus through a series of hallways that seemed to actively absorb sound and joy. The portraits on the walls were all of stern-looking people who appeared to have just been told their favorite dog had run away. Some were in human form. Some were paintings of wolves. One was a wolf wearing a small crown, which was either a metaphor or deeply literal, and I wasn't sure which was funnier. "The king is in the throne room," Marcus announced, pushing open a set of doors that weighed more than my car. The throne room was a lot. There was a throne, of course, perched on a dais like an overly dramatic piece of furniture waiting for its close-up. And on the throne sat the king. King Gideon was exactly as advertised on the tin of mysterious, brooding monarch. He was dark-haired, impossibly handsome in a way that suggested he was carved from rock and shadows, and was staring into the middle distance as if contemplating the fall of empires. He was also younger than I'd expected, late 20s at most, which made the whole brooding king act either very impressive or slightly ridiculous. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire college education, which, given that I'd graduated only 4 years ago, was a low bar, but still. When he stood, he was even taller than I'd anticipated. He moved with a liquid grace that was both intimidating and deeply unfair. "Miss Larson," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." I gave him my brightest, most professional smile. "A pleasure, Your Majesty. I'm excited to get started. This place has wonderful bones." It was my go-to line for houses that were one stiff breeze away from total collapse. He was about to say something else, something kingly and intimidating, I'm sure, when his eyes met mine. Something strange happened. His expression, so carefully controlled, flickered. His pupils blew wide, and for a half-second, his irises flashed, a bright, startling gold that bled through the gray like sunlight through storm clouds. He took a half-step forward, a jerky, uncoordinated movement that was completely at odds with the grace he'd shown a moment before. And then, he knocked over a vase. It was a truly hideous vase, a lumpy dark blue thing sitting on a pedestal next to the throne. It toppled in what felt like slow motion, hitting the stone floor with a deafening final crash. Silence. Utter, horrified silence. King Gideon stared at the pile of ceramic shards as if it were a fallen comrade. My first thought was not about the priceless ancient artifact that had just been destroyed. My first thought was, good, that thing was ugly anyway. My second thought was, he's clumsy. I'd seen shifters move. They were fluid, fast, precise. Their whole thing was preternatural physical control. This man was supposed to be the most powerful wolf in the region, and he had just walked into his own furniture like a golden retriever puppy discovering linoleum for the first time. Marcus, bless his weary soul, didn't even flinch. He just sighed, a deep put-upon sound. "I'll get a dustpan," he said, already turning to leave. Gideon didn't seem to hear him. He was still staring at the floor, a faint flush creeping up his neck. He looked utterly mortified. For a man who was supposed to be the king of all wolves, he looked like a teenager who had just tripped in front of his crush. A thought occurred to me, a wild, ridiculous thought, and I dismissed it immediately. Kings did not get flustered by decorators from Cleveland. I couldn't help it. A small smile tugged at my lips. I cleared my throat, pulling out my trusty clipboard. "Well," I said, clicking my pen, "that's one less thing to rehome. Now, about this lighting situation." Gideon finally looked up at me, his composure reasserting itself, but there was a crack in the facade. The intimidating Alpha King was gone, replaced by a man who had just made a fool of himself. And frankly, that was a client I knew how to handle. Gideon's wolf was, generally speaking, a creature of dignity. It had faced down rival packs. It had commanded the loyalty of thousands. It had carried the weight of a crown inherited too young with the quiet, watchful patience of an apex predator. And now, approximately 45 seconds after meeting Bryn Larson, it was composing sonnets. Mate, mate, mate. She smells like sunshine and fresh paint and the exact thing we have been missing our whole life. Ours. Gideon wanted to strangle it. He was the Alpha King. He did not drop things. He certainly did not drop a 1,000-year-old ceremonial urn gifted by the first Silver Moon Alpha because a small, vibrant human woman with eyes the color of warm honey smiled at him. Yet, the evidence of his catastrophic failure lay in a glittering pile of blue dust at his feet. And the woman, his mate, his Bryn, was looking at him, not with awe or fear, but with the professional, slightly pitying gaze of a contractor assessing a fixer-upper. He was a fixer-upper. His entire ancestral home was a fixer-upper. The mate bond roared through him like a river breaking through a dam. Every nerve ending was on fire. She was right there. The scent of her, warm skin, something floral, the sharp, pleasant bite of acrylic paint lodged permanently under her nails, was the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered. His wolf was rolling around in it like a dog in fresh grass. She can't feel it, he reminded himself. She's human. She doesn't know. The realization was a cold blade in the middle of all that warmth. She was smiling at him politely, professionally, the way she probably smiled at every client. To her, he was a man in a suit who had just broken his own vase. "We should tell her," his wolf suggested, its voice settling from the initial frenzy into something more earnest. "She seems reasonable. She would understand." He was absolutely not going to tell her. Not now, not like this. Not when she was standing in his throne room with a clipboard, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world had just rearranged itself around her. "The lighting," he managed to say, his voice a little tight. "Yes, it is traditional." "It's depressing," Bryn countered, her pen scratching against her clipboard. She walked around the throne room, her practical heels clicking on the stone. She was a whirlwind of color and energy in his world of gray. "This room has the ambiance of a high-end crypt. We need sconces, uplighting, maybe a chandelier that doesn't look like it was forged in the heart of a dying star." She is correct. This place is terrible. We should have fixed it years ago. "I am open to suggestions," he said, striving for kingly magnanimity. Bryn stopped and beamed at him. It was like a physical blow. His wolf went very still, the way it did when tracking something important. All attention, no noise. "Great, because I have a lot of them." She flipped open a portfolio, and the world exploded into color. Swatches of fabric and paint chips were laid out on a nearby table, a vibrant rebellion against the monochromatic tyranny of his home. There were blues the color of a summer sky, greens like new spring leaves, yellows that were cheerful and unapologetic. "The yellow one," his wolf said with quiet certainty. "She likes that one the most. Watch her hands when she touches it." He watched. She did. Her fingers lingered on the sunny swatch, a tiny unconscious caress. This, Bryn said, pointing to it, is what I'm thinking for the main hall. It's called Morning Glow. It will open up the space, make it feel welcoming instead of... She gestured vaguely at everything. He knew. And for the drapes in here, something to contrast with the stone. Maybe this sapphire blue silk? She held up a shimmering piece of fabric. It was beautiful. It would look incredible. The great hall doors groaned open. In walked 3 of the oldest pack members. Garrett, whose face had been permanently fixed in a scowl since birth. Margaret, who looked upon anything made after the 14th century with deep suspicion. And Hector, who mostly just enjoyed being contrary. They stopped dead, their collective gazes falling upon the riot of color on the table. Garrett's lip curled. "What is this frivolity?" he rasped. Bryn, bless her fearless human heart, didn't even blink. "It's a mood board, sir. We're discussing a new aesthetic for the manor. Something a bit more livable and a bit less eternal damnation." Margaret gasped. "The Blackwood walls have been the color of dignified shadow for a millennium. It is our way." "And it looks like it," Bryn said, her tone dangerously cheerful. "But your way could use a refresh, don't you think? How about we honor the tradition with a nice accent wall?" Gideon stepped forward, placing himself beside his mate. Not in front of, beside. He could feel her startled glance, but he kept his attention on his pack. "This renovation is happening," he said. His voice was calm, quiet, and carried the weight of a man who was not asking. "Miss Larson has my full confidence. If you have specific concerns about specific rooms, you may raise them with me. You will not raise them with her." It was not a supernatural compulsion. It was simply the truth, delivered by a man who had earned the right to deliver it. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head. They were wolves. They understood authority. They didn't have to like it. They just had to know it was real. They left, grumbling, and Bryn let out a breath. Well, that was bracing. She looked at him sidelong, a curious expression on her face. "You didn't have to do that." "They will come around," he said. "They always do. It just takes them a while." She laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, and his wolf tucked it away like something precious. Chapter 2. My professional opinion was that the pack was collectively, magnificently terrible at adjusting to change. It started with the paint. My first major order was 20 gallons of a beautiful, calming color called duck egg blue for the upper guest wing. When the delivery arrived, carried by 2 enormous wolves in human form who treated the paint cans like they were transporting nuclear material, the cans were not labeled duck egg blue. They were labeled grave soil brown. I stared at the dark, muddy sludge in the can. It was the color of despair. "What happened to my duck egg blue?" I asked the delivery wolf, a hulking man named Boris, who had more hair on his forearms than I had on my entire head. Boris shrugged. The pack supply coordinator said the original was unsuitable. Replaced it with something more appropriate. He paused. I think he meant more brown. The pack supply coordinator, it turned out, was Garrett. Of course it was. Then came the pillows. I had sourced a collection of the most wonderful throw pillows for the main sitting room. They were plush, oversized, and in a delightful array of pastels: mint green, soft coral, and a lovely lavender. They were the antithesis of everything Blackwood Manor stood for, and I loved them. I left the box in the sitting room overnight. When I came back the next morning, 3 young wolves, actual wolves, in actual fur, were asleep on the shredded remains of my pillows. They had torn them apart and then nested in the stuffing, which was now a fluffy white carpet covering every surface in the room. One of them was snoring. Another had a piece of coral fabric stuck to his ear. They didn't look malicious. They looked comfortable. They looked like they'd found the softest thing in the castle for the first time in their lives and had absolutely no idea what else to do with it except destroy it and then sleep on its remains. Marcus appeared behind me, surveying the carnage with the dead-eyed stare of a man for whom this was Tuesday. "They liked them," he said, his voice flat. "That's actually the problem. They ate them. They nested in them. It's a compliment, technically. They do it with things that smell right. I stared at him. My throw pillows smell right? Apparently, you should be flattered. I was not flattered. The final straw was the wallpaper. It was for the breakfast nook, a small, sad room with one window overlooking a perpetually damp courtyard. I'd chosen a gorgeous, cheerful print of lemons on a creamy background. It was sunny, it was happy, it was perfect. The rolls arrived, and I left them carefully propped against a wall. The next day, I found the wallpaper in ribbons. Not shredded by malice, but covered in long, deep claw marks in oddly regular patterns. Almost like decoration. A young pack member, a girl of about 19, still in the slightly awkward phase between adolescent wolf and adult composure, was standing near the wreckage, her face a complicated mix of guilt and pride. I was trying to improve it, she said, very quietly. The lemons were nice, but I thought they needed texture. Texture, I repeated, holding up a strip that now looked like it had been through a document shredder operated by a bear. Claw texture. It's a traditional wolf art form. I took a very deep breath. Then I gathered up the most pathetic, shredded strip of lemon-printed paper I could find and stormed through the castle. I followed the sound of Gideon's voice, pushed open a set of heavy oak doors without knocking, and found myself in what appeared to be a strategy room. Gideon was standing over a massive table spread with maps, surrounded by several serious-looking pack members, in the middle of what was clearly important business. He looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked suspiciously like delight, which he immediately crushed back down into royal composure. I held up the mangled strip of wallpaper. It fluttered sadly in my hand. Your Majesty, I said, my voice trembling with controlled rage. Your pack has declared war on citrus. There was a beat of stunned silence. One of the wolves at the table, a barrel-chested man with a scar across his nose, made a sound like a tea kettle trying not to whistle. Gideon looked at me, then at the wallpaper. His mouth did something complicated. Was that the lemon print? He asked. And the fact that he knew which wallpaper I meant, by name and pattern, when he was supposedly in the middle of territorial negotiations, landed on me in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was supposed to be, I said, a fraction less angry, before it received an unsolicited artistic collaboration. He held up a hand to his companions. Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us. They filed out, several of them giving me looks of undisguised curiosity, and, from the scarred man, something that looked a lot like respect. When we were alone, Gideon walked around the table toward me. He stopped a few feet away. He always stopped a few feet away, like he was consciously managing the distance between us, which I'd started to notice and couldn't explain. I'll handle it, he said. And then, quieter. I'm sorry, they're not trying to be difficult. Most of them have never seen wallpaper that wasn't gray. They don't know what to do with color. The girl said she was adding claw texture, I said, and despite everything, I felt my mouth twitch. Was it good claw texture, at least? It was terrible claw texture, Gideon, completely uneven, no sense of pattern. He smiled. Not the careful, controlled smile he gave the pack. A real one, sudden and warm, that changed his entire face. It lasted about 3 seconds before he caught himself and reassembled his composure. But I saw it. I filed it away next to all the other small, confusing things I was collecting about this man. I'll address the pack, he said, formally. You don't have to make a whole speech about, too late, I've already started composing it in my head. I'm going to cite studies about the psychological benefits of natural light. It's going to be magnificent. And it was. The speech, as it came to be known in pack lore, happened that evening in the Great Hall. The entire pack was assembled, nearly 200 wolves, in human form, sprawled across the dark furniture like a particularly intimidating family reunion. There were also about 15 wolves still in fur, lying in a heap near the fireplace, because apparently shifting back for a meeting was optional. Gideon stood at the front, holding my sun-kissed lemon paint swatch like a battle standard. "This is not merely yellow," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "This is morning glow, and it represents the future of this pack." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Several of the fur wolves lifted their heads. "For 1,000 years we have lived in this manner, and for 1,000 years it has looked like the inside of a boot. A magnificent boot, an ancestral boot, but a boot nonetheless." Someone in the back snorted. "Miss Larson's renovation is not an attack on tradition. It is an investment in our well-being. Improved natural light has been proven to increase vitamin D absorption, leading to stronger bones for our warriors." He paused for effect. "The color yellow is scientifically linked to improved cognitive function. It stimulates mental acuity." This was complete nonsense, delivered with the gravitas of a head of state. I was standing off to the side, clutching my clipboard, trying very hard not to either laugh or cry. "Furthermore," he continued, warming to his theme like a man who had found his calling, "properly selected textiles reduce ambient stress. A well-designed living space has been shown in multiple studies, human and wolf, to decrease territorial aggression by up to 17%. He was making up the statistics. He was making up all of it. He was standing in front of his entire pack, the most powerful shifter for 500 miles, inventing science about throw pillows, and doing it with such total conviction that several wolves were actually nodding. Margaret in the front row raised her hand. "Does this mean we cannot scratch the new things?" "Correct," Gideon said. "The new things are under royal protection." "What about sitting on them? In fur?" "Negotiable," he allowed, "but gently." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was doing this for me. Not as a grand romantic gesture. He didn't know I was watching his face this carefully. He was doing it because I had been frustrated and he'd listened. And then he'd handled it in the most absurd, over-the-top, completely sincere way possible. Something warm shifted in my chest. I told it to be quiet. He was a client. I was working late. After the speech, the open sabotage had stopped. The replacement duck egg blue arrived unmolested. New pillows appeared, and while I did find a wolf sleeping on one the next morning, the pillow was intact, and the wolf looked deeply apologetic when he woke up and found me standing over him. I'd claimed the Grand Library as my temporary command center. It was a magnificent 2-story room lined with thousands of books that probably hadn't been opened in centuries. It smelled of old paper and leather and that ever-present wild undertone of wolf. I had my laptop open on a huge mahogany table, surrounded by floor plans, fabric swatches, and half-empty mugs of tea. I was so engrossed in figuring out how to subtly introduce a sectional sofa into a room built in the 1100s that I didn't hear him approach. Shifters moved like that, silent, even in a building made entirely of stone. "Working late, Miss Larson?" Gideon's low voice made me jump. I spun around in my chair. He was standing in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs. He wasn't dressed in his kingly suit, but in simple dark trousers and a soft gray sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. Less like a monarch and more like a man who'd had a long day and wanted to sit somewhere quiet. "Your Majesty," I said, my heart doing a little flutter kick I chose to ignore. "Just plotting the next phase of my color-based insurrection." He allowed a small smile as he walked over, setting one of the mugs down beside me. "I thought you might need reinforcements." It was chamomile, my favorite. I hadn't told him that. I'd mentioned it once, offhandedly, to Marcus 3 weeks ago. There was no way a king remembered his decorator's tea preference. There was no way he'd gone to the kitchen, made it himself, because this didn't smell like the kitchen's generic brand. This smelled specific. The good loose-leaf chamomile that I knew wasn't stocked here, because I'd looked, and brought it to her in the library at 11 o'clock at night. Except he had, and he was standing there, looking at my chaotic mess of plans, acting like it was nothing. "Thank you," I said quietly, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "For this, and for the vitamin D speech. That was a masterpiece of public persuasion." He actually chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. I have found that one can win many arguments by framing them in the language of strategic benefits, even arguments about paint. Was any of it true? The vitamin D part is real. The 17% statistic was entirely fabricated. Don't tell Garrett. I laughed, and something in his expression softened. He pulled up a heavy wooden chair and sat opposite me, and for a moment, we were just two people in a warm room surrounded by books and the pleasant smell of chamomile and old pages. "Can I ask you something?" I ventured. "Off the record. No kings, no decorators, just people." He seemed surprised, but he nodded. "What do you want, Gideon? Not what the pack wants, not what tradition dictates. What do you, the man who lives here, actually want for this house?" The question hung in the air between us. He looked around the vast, shadowy library, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than regal authority in his expression. It was a deep, profound weariness. "I'm tired of the gloom," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I grew up in these halls. I learned to walk on these cold stones. Every portrait is an ancestor judging me. Every shadow holds the weight of 1,000 years of expectation." He looked at me, and his gaze was so direct, so unguarded, it felt like he was letting me see a part of him no one else ever did. "I don't want a fortress anymore, Bryn. I want a home." The silence that followed was different from the usual silences of this castle. It wasn't cold or heavy. It was full. The comedy of our situation, the absurdity of the paint speeches and the pillow massacres, all of it faded away. In its place was this quiet, raw moment of honesty. I saw the weight he carried, the loneliness of his position. He wasn't just a brooding, clumsy client. He was a man trapped in a gilded, gloomy cage. I opened my mouth to say something. I'm not sure what, but it felt important, when a sound like a small building collapsing echoed from the corridor outside. We both jumped. Gideon was on his feet instantly, his body shifting into a stance that was pure predator, coiled, still, every sense focused. I could see the wolf in him in that moment, not in his eyes or his face, but in the absolute economy of his movement. Nothing wasted, everything ready. He relaxed almost immediately, which meant he'd heard something I couldn't, a heartbeat, a scent, something that told him it wasn't a threat. He went to the door. In the hallway, a truly spectacular amount of decorative armor lay scattered across the floor. Breastplates, gauntlets, a helmet rolling slowly in circles. And standing in the middle of the wreckage, a young wolf, maybe 14, frozen in the universal posture of someone who has touched something they were not supposed to touch. He was holding a halberd that was taller than he was. "I was just looking at it," the boy whispered. Gideon stared at him, then at the armor, then back at the boy. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Go to bed, Callum." Callum went to bed, at speed. Gideon turned back to me, and the raw, unguarded man from a moment ago was gone, replaced by a king with a tired headache. But the moment wasn't entirely lost. I'd seen him. Behind the crown, behind the careful composure, just him. And now my mission wasn't just about fighting beige anymore. It was about building a home for a lonely king. Which was a problem, because he was a client, and I was starting to think about him in ways that had nothing to do with his drapery needs. Chapter 3. The ballroom had been the worst room in the castle, and it was becoming the best. I'd banished the oppressive drapes, blood-red velvet that smelled of mothballs and old resentment, and replaced them with shimmering silks in deep sapphire and silver that caught the light like water. The stone walls were being cleaned for the first time in probably decades, revealing a pale, beautiful gray underneath the grime that worked perfectly with the new palette. It was going to be magnificent. I was perched on a very tall rolling ladder, adjusting a swath of silver fabric over a high-arched window, humming to myself, a cheerful, tuneless sound that echoed in the vaulted space when I felt it. That specific, electric awareness of being watched by a shifter. I didn't turn around. I'd gotten used to it over the past few weeks. Gideon had developed a habit of finding excuses to be wherever I was working. He would inspect the stonework or review the structural integrity of whatever room I was in, standing at a careful distance, watching my work with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to his interest in furnishing textiles. Today, he was standing near the far wall, pretending to examine a newly cleaned section of stone. I could feel his attention on me like a physical thing, like standing in a beam of sunlight. Two of the older pack members, Garrett and Margaret, had drifted into the ballroom with the disapproving air of health inspectors at a condemned restaurant. "So flimsy," Margaret muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, fingering the edge of a new sapphire drape. "There is no gravitas. It looks like a lady's boudoir." Garrett sniffed. The traditional blackwood velvet spoke of power. This speaks of weakness. From my perch on the ladder, I called down. "It's called elegance. You should try it sometime. It's much lighter to carry around than all that doom." I heard Gideon make a sound that could have been a cough or could have been a suppressed laugh. But I didn't look at him, because I was 16 feet in the air and the ladder wobbled. Not a violent shake, not malicious. Garrett had simply walked too close, his bulk brushing the base as he moved to examine a drape. But at this height, on a ladder that was older than democracy and had one wheel that stuck, it was enough. The world tilted. I grabbed for the fabric, which was silk and therefore useless as a handhold. And for one horrible second, I was just falling, my stomach lurching, my arms flailing at nothing. And then I wasn't. I was being held. Securely, completely, by arms that had appeared out of nowhere and caught me like I weighed nothing at all. The transition from falling to held was so fast that my brain needed a moment to catch up. Gideon had crossed the entire ballroom in the time it had taken me to tip sideways. He was holding me against his chest, and I could feel his heartbeat, fast, much faster than his composed expression suggested. His arms were solid around me, his grip gentle but absolutely immovable. He smelled like pine and cold air and something underneath that was purely him, warm, deep, animal. My face was approximately 4 inches from his neck, and my entire nervous system was short-circuiting. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "Just my belief in ladder safety," I managed. My voice came out higher than intended. He set me on my feet, carefully, like I was made of something expensive. His hand stayed on my arms for a beat longer than necessary, just long enough for me to notice, and for him to notice me noticing. Garrett, to his credit, looked horrified. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was—" "It's fine," I said quickly. "No harm done." Gideon looked at Garrett, and whatever the old wolf saw in his king's eyes made him take a step back. There was no flash of gold, no growl, no supernatural command. Just a look that said, very clearly, "That will never happen again." It was authority that came from being exactly who he was, and it landed with more weight than any magic could. "Perhaps," Gideon said, his voice perfectly even, "the ballroom should be cleared while Miss Larson works at height." Garrett and Margaret left without another word. And then it was just me and Gideon, standing very close together in a ballroom full of sapphire silk, and neither of us was talking about the ladder. He was looking at me in that way again, the way that wasn't about drapes or paint or any professional concern. It was a look that made my breath come short and my professional boundaries feel very, very thin. He leaned in, just slightly. His eyes dropped to my mouth. I swear the castle itself held its breath. And then, a crash. A massive, resonant, absolutely spectacular crash from the hall outside, followed by a yelp, followed by a voice I recognized. "I didn't touch the armor this time. It fell on its own, I swear." Callum. Again. Gideon closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek twitched in a way that spoke of a man at war with the universe's comedic timing. He took a step back, his composure snapping back into place like a rubber band. "If you'll excuse me," he said, his voice clipped with a formality that was entirely at odds with the fact that he'd been about to kiss me 3 seconds ago. "I need to deal with that." He strode away. I stood alone in the ballroom, my heart hammering, my face hot, and a hysterical laugh building in my chest. The castle was conspiring against us. That was the only explanation. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm. I would work, Gideon would find reasons to be nearby. We would talk about the house, about the pack, about increasingly unrelated things. He asked me about Cleveland, about how I'd started my business, about my favorite buildings and the ugliest house I'd ever worked on. He remembered everything, not in a showy way, in a quiet way, the details appearing days later as small, handled things. I mentioned once that the library's reading lamps gave me a headache. 2 days later, new lamps appeared, warm-toned, the exact kind I preferred. No announcement, no credit taken. I mentioned that the kitchen's coffee was terrible. The next week, there was good coffee, just there, in the kitchen, as if it had always been there. I kept catching him in the rooms I'd finished, not inspecting them, just being in them. Sitting in the library in one of the new armchairs, reading by the warm lamplight, his hand resting on the fabric of the armrest like he was testing whether it was real. Standing in the breakfast nook, the one with the replacement lemon wallpaper, installed under armed guard and so far unscathed. Looking out the window with an expression on his face that I could only describe as bewildered happiness. Like he didn't quite know what to do with a room that wasn't trying to depress him. One evening I found him in the finished morning room, the one painted in sun-kissed lemon. He was just standing there in the golden light, his hand touching the wall. He didn't know I was watching. His face was completely unguarded, not the king, not the careful man he presented to the pack. Just someone standing in a room that felt like sunlight, looking like he'd been cold for a very long time and had only just realized it. My heart did something painful and complicated. I backed away before he saw me. The next morning, he came to check on the ballroom progress in his casual clothes, the gray sweater, the dark trousers, barefoot on the stone because apparently shoes were optional for wolves, even in human form. He was leaning over my work table, studying a floor plan, asking a question about the sconce placement, and I completely lost the thread of what he was saying because his sleeves were pushed up to his elbows and I was staring at his forearms. They were ridiculous forearms, tanned, corded with lean muscle, a vein running along the inside of his wrist. His hands were spread flat on the table, long fingers, and I had a sudden, vivid, completely unprofessional thought about what those hands would feel like that had nothing to do with furniture placement. "Bryn," he said, and I realized he'd asked me something. And I'd been standing there with my mouth slightly open like a woman who had never seen a man's arms before. "Sorry," I said too quickly. "Sconces, yes, brushed nickel, definitely brushed nickel." He gave me a slightly puzzled look. I turned away and busied myself with a fabric swatch, my face burning. This was a professional relationship. I was a professional. I did not lose my ability to form sentences because a client rolled up his sleeves. Except apparently I did. And that was a problem I did not have a paint color for. He was ridiculous. He was a king who made up statistics about interior design and brought me chamomile tea at 11 at night and caught me when I fell with the reflexes of someone who'd been ready to catch me since the moment I walked in the door. And he had forearms that should be classified as a workplace hazard. And he was my client. My client. The man paying me. The man whose home I was contractually obligated to improve. There were professional boundaries, and I was leaning against them so hard they were starting to creak. There was also the thing I couldn't quite put my finger on, the way the pack looked at me, not with hostility, not with the confusion of the early days, but with a kind of knowing warmth that I hadn't earned. One of the kitchen staff, a woman named Petra, had started saving me the good pastries in the morning. A young wolf I'd never spoken to held the door for me and then blushed so hard he walked into the doorframe. And once, when I was working in the ballroom, an older pack member, Hector, the contrary one, had watched me from across the room for several minutes and then said, unprompted, "He seems happier, whatever you're doing," and then walked away before I could ask what he meant. I told myself it was about the renovation. The castle was brighter, lighter. Of course they seemed friendlier. Of course the mood had changed. I was wrong about what had changed, but I didn't know that yet. The second almost kiss happened in the courtyard. The courtyard had been my greatest challenge. It was a damp, gray rectangle of stone that received exactly 45 minutes of direct sunlight per day and had all the charm of a parking garage. I had spent 2 weeks transforming it, climbing plants in massive stone pots, a fountain that actually worked, lanterns strung overhead that would glow warm amber at night. I was adjusting one of the lanterns, standing on a step stool this time. I had learned from the ladder. When Gideon came to see the finished result, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at the courtyard, the climbing jasmine, the soft light, the water trickling over stone, and his expression broke open. "This is..." He didn't finish the sentence. He walked in slowly, looking around like he'd stepped into a different world. "It's just plants and light," I said, stepping down from my stool. "Nothing revolutionary." "It's everything revolutionary," he said quietly, and when he turned to me, his eyes were bright and completely unguarded. "You changed this. You change everything you touch." We were standing very close. The jasmine smelled incredible. The lanterns cast warm light across his face, softening every hard angle. And he was looking at me like I was the most important thing in his world. His hand came up, slowly, giving me time to pull away. He tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing my cheek, and every rational thought in my head evacuated the premises. He leaned in. I leaned in. A wolf howled. Not a casual, conversational wolf howl, a full, sustained, operatic wolf howl that echoed off every stone surface in the courtyard and was immediately answered by 4 more wolves from different parts of the castle, creating an impromptu, deeply enthusiastic canine symphony. We sprang apart. Gideon's face went through about 7 emotions in 2 seconds, settling on a kind of murderous resignation. "That would be the midnight watch change," Marcus said, appearing in the doorway with the timing of a man who was either psychic or had been waiting. "They do that. Every night. You know this." "I know this," Gideon said through his teeth. Marcus looked at me. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the romantic courtyard lighting. His face was the face of a man who had been watching a slow-motion disaster unfold for weeks and had reached a place of zen acceptance about it. "Lovely evening," he said, and left. Chapter 4. I found out on a Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a overheard confession or a revelation in a storm. It was just a Tuesday, and I was in the kitchen getting coffee, and 2 pack members were having a conversation at the table that they clearly thought was private. "She still doesn't know?" one of them, a woman named Petra, who worked in the kitchens, said, her voice low. "How could she?" the other replied. "She's human. She can't feel it." "But the whole pack knows. It's obvious. Have you seen the way he looks at her? The wolf is barely contained." Marcus said the king ordered everyone to keep quiet, formally. Said he didn't want anyone influencing her before she'd had a chance to... To what? Make up her own mind? While he's out there making her special tea and catching her off ladders? I know, but you don't defy a direct order from the king. Not about this. Choose him? She's his fated mate. It's done. Everyone can smell it on him. She can't. Still, seems dishonest, doesn't it? The whole pack walking around on eggshells, knowing something about her own life that she doesn't? Hector nearly said something to her last week, and Marcus had to pull him aside. The coffee mug in my hand had gone very still. Fated mate. The words hung in the air like smoke. I knew the concept, vaguely, the way humans knew most shifter things, from a distance, from news articles and cultural osmosis. A biological match. An involuntary, irrevocable recognition. Something the wolf chose without the man having a say. Fated mate. The whole pack knows. Everyone can smell it on him. I put the mug down. My hands were shaking, which surprised me because my brain hadn't caught up yet. My brain was still several steps behind, stuck on the word fated, turning it over and over like a stone. Maybe the hiring itself was clean. Maybe Marcus really had found me through normal channels. Maybe Gideon really had signed off on my portfolio before we'd ever met. But the moment I walked into that throne room, and his eyes went gold and his hands went clumsy, from that second forward, everything that had happened between us was contaminated. Every warm moment, every quiet gesture, every almost kiss. Was any of it him choosing me? Or was all of it his wolf dragging him towards something he couldn't control? The tea, the lamps, the way he was always nearby, the way he caught me when I fell, like he'd been ready, like he'd been waiting. Not a man appreciating good work, a wolf guarding its mate. 6 weeks of what I thought was something building between two people, and the whole pack had been watching it like a nature documentary. Oh look, the king's mate doesn't know she's the king's mate. How adorable. Did he even like the yellow? Or did his wolf like it because I liked it? I left the kitchen. I walked to my room, closed the door, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall. A wall I'd painted myself. Peaceful dove. A color I'd chosen because it was calming and gentle, and I was proud of it. I thought about calling Marcus. Then I thought about calling Gideon. Then I thought about getting in my yellow Fiat and driving until the GPS came back to life. Instead, I cried. Not a lot. Just enough. And then I got angry. Gideon knew something was wrong the moment he entered the library the next morning. Her scent was different. The bright, warm smell of Bryn, sunshine and paint and cheerful human energy was still there, but it was layered with something cold and sharp underneath. Something that smelled like hurt. His wolf went rigid. Wrong. Something is wrong. Fix it. She was standing behind the big mahogany table, her plans laid out in front of her, but she wasn't working on them. She was standing with her arms crossed, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were flat. Fated mate, she said. 2 words. They landed like stones. The room went very quiet. Gideon felt the blood drain from his face. How? It doesn't matter how. What matters is that the entire pack knows, and I didn't. 6 weeks, Gideon. 200 wolves walking around knowing something about my life that I didn't. Every person in this castle looking at me and seeing the king's mate, while I thought they were seeing a decorator doing her job. He flinched. He couldn't help it. The words hit something deep and exposed. That's not... When did you know? The silence that followed was the worst silence Gideon had ever endured. Worse than the silence before battle. Worse than the silence of an empty castle. Because she was looking at him and waiting for an answer. And the answer was precise, and she deserved precision. The moment you walked into the throne room, he said. Because the truth was, the only thing he had left. Marcus found you through normal channels. I approved the contract based on your portfolio. I had never seen your face before that day. And then you smiled at me, and my wolf. He stopped. The hiring was real, Bryn. Your work was the reason you were here. But everything after that first moment, the tea, the speeches, the reasons to be near you, that was the bond, and the man. And I don't know how to separate them, and I should have told you. Yes, you should have. I wanted you to choose without what? Without information? Without the one piece of context that would have let me understand why the most powerful shifter in the region was knocking over his own furniture and memorizing my tea order? Her voice cracked, and the sound of it broke something in him. I don't have a wolf, Gideon. I can't feel what you feel. All I had was. I thought I was choosing. I thought the things I was feeling were mine. They are yours. How would I know that? How would I know the difference between falling for someone and being managed into it by 200 wolves who all knew the ending before I'd started the story? He had no answer. He had spent 6 weeks imagining this conversation, and he had never, not once, found an answer to that question. Because she was right. She couldn't feel the bond. She couldn't know whether what she felt was hers or his or something between them that neither controlled. His wolf, for the first time in weeks, was completely silent. No encouragement, no commentary, just a vast, aching quiet. And then, very softly, in a voice that Gideon had never heard from it before, not manic, not enthusiastic, not the golden retriever, but something old and tired and unspeakably gentle, it said, "She is the first person to make you laugh like that. You know that's not the bond. That's her." Gideon closed his eyes. "I understand if you need to leave," he said. The words cost him more than anything he'd ever said from the throne. "The contract is yours regardless. Full payment. You owe me nothing. If you want to go, I will not stop you." He meant it, every word, and meaning it was the hardest thing he had ever done. Bryn stared at him. Her eyes were red, but her jaw was set. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she picked up her clipboard. "I'm not finished," she said, her voice clipped and professional and still a little raw. "The East Wing is half done and the ballroom sconces haven't arrived. I don't leave jobs incomplete." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a choice. It was a woman who finished what she started. He nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. She turned back to her plans. He stood there for another moment, breathing, and then he left. Chapter 5. I stayed because I was a professional, and the East Wing was half painted. That was what I told myself. That was the reason. Professional integrity, nothing more. For 2 weeks, Gideon gave me space. Complete, absolute, excruciating space. No late-night tea. No casual appearances in whatever room I was working in. No finding reasons to be nearby. The castle was enormous enough that avoidance was logistically simple. He kept to the North Wing and his offices. I worked in the East Wing and the ballroom. Marcus acted as a silent buffer, adjusting schedules so our paths didn't cross. Meals were delivered to my room, or I ate in the kitchen at odd hours. The pack, sensing something had shifted, gave me a wide, nervous berth. Gideon was simply, thoroughly absent. It was awful. I threw myself into work with a fury that surprised even me. I painted the East Wing guest rooms in 3 days, a job that should have taken a week. I chose colors that were sharper than usual, bolder, almost aggressive. One room ended up in a red so deep, it was nearly angry. I stared at it for a long time before repainting it in a calm sage green. Because I was a professional, and the room hadn't done anything wrong. The castle felt different without him hovering. The rooms I was working on felt like rooms again, just spaces with walls and windows. The breakfast nook was charming, but it was just a nook. The library was warm and well lit, and it was just a library. I hated it. I hated that I hated it. I hated that the absence of a man I was angry at left a hole in every room I walked into. I hated that I'd painted an entire guest room the color of my own frustration and then had to fix it. Marcus found me in the courtyard one evening, sitting on the edge of the fountain, not working for the first time in weeks. "He's miserable," Marcus said, sitting down beside me. "Good." "No, I mean genuinely miserable. He hasn't eaten properly in days. He's been sleeping in his office. The pack is worried." He paused. "His wolf has gone quiet." I looked at him. Quiet? A wolf going quiet is not a good sign. It means the man and the wolf are in alignment, and what they're aligned on is grief. He rubbed his face. I've known him since we were kids, Bryn. I've seen him take the crown too young, carry a weight no one his age should carry, and never once ask for help. I've never seen him like this. He lied to me, Marcus. He withheld something he should have told you from the start. Yes. He was wrong. Completely wrong. Marcus looked at the jasmine climbing the courtyard wall, the lanterns glowing amber, the fountain trickling. But I've also watched him, every night for 6 weeks, make your specific tea with loose-leaf chamomile he ordered from a shop in Vermont because you mentioned once that it was your favorite, and bring it to you at 11 o'clock because he knew you'd still be working. Not because of the bond, because he was paying attention. I didn't say anything. The bond doesn't make you remember someone's tea. It doesn't make you learn which lamplight gives them headaches. It doesn't make you stand in a room someone painted and touch the wall because it's the first beautiful thing you've seen in your own home in your entire life. He stood up. The bond tells the wolf who. Everything after that? That's the man. He left me there with the jasmine and the fountain, and a feeling in my chest that I didn't have a name for. I found him in the morning room. It was midnight, and the room was dark except for the moonlight coming through the newly cleaned windows, falling across the sun-kissed lemon walls in silver and blue. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He looked exhausted. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked up when I came in. His expression, a complicated mixture of hope and fear and resignation, nearly undid me. I sat down on the floor across from him. The yellow walls surrounded us, bright even in the dark. You should have told me, I said. I know. On day 1, before the contract, before any of it. I know. Because I spent 6 weeks building something I was proud of, and then I had to wonder if any of it was real. He was quiet for a moment. Then, your work is real, Bryn. It was real before I met you. It will be real long after. He stopped himself. It is the most real thing in this castle. And us? Is that real? I don't know how to prove it, he said. And the honesty in his voice was raw and unpolished and nothing like the careful king. I can't separate the bond from the man. They're the same thing. My wolf recognized you, and then I spent 6 weeks learning who you are, and his voice broke, just slightly. I don't know how to unknow you. I don't want to. You made me tea from Vermont. He blinked. Marcus told you that. He told me a lot of things. I picked at a paint chip on my jeans. Peaceful Dove, from a touch-up job last week. Here's what I know. I can't feel the bond. I never will. I will never have the certainty you have. What I have is... I noticed that you remember things. I noticed that you stand in rooms I've finished and touch the walls. I noticed that you made up fake science about vitamin D in front of 200 wolves because I was frustrated about wallpaper. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. So faint, so tired. That's not a bond, Gideon. That's just a man. A man who listens and shows up and is willing to be completely ridiculous if it helps. I took a breath. I'm still angry. I might be angry for a while, but I didn't stay because of the East Wing. He looked at me. The hope in his expression was almost unbearable. I stayed because this place feels different when you're in it. And I don't think that's supernatural. I think that's just what it feels like when someone matters. The silence that followed was not awkward or heavy or full of unspoken things. It was just quiet. 2 people sitting on the floor of a yellow room in the dark, figuring out what came next. He reached over and took my hand. His fingers were warm, careful, and they laced through mine like a question. I let him. I squeezed back. And that was the answer. The third almost kiss happened 2 days later, in the hallway outside the finished ballroom. We were arguing about whether the sconces should be brass or brushed nickel, a genuine professional disagreement, heated and specific, the kind we'd never had before because before, he'd agreed with everything I said. Brass is traditional, he insisted. Brass is dated. Brushed nickel complements the sapphire silk. This isn't negotiable. I am a king. Everything is negotiable. Not sconce finishes. This is my domain. He stepped closer. His eyes were warm and argumentative and alive. Your domain is my castle. Your castle is my project. We were standing very, very close. The argument had turned into something else entirely, the way arguments sometimes do when both people are smiling too hard to maintain them. He leaned in. I went up on my toes. From inside the ballroom, a sound like a freight train hitting a chandelier. Glass, metal, and what sounded like an entire shelf of something fragile hitting stone. This was followed by absolute silence. And then a small, guilty voice. I think it was already loose. Callum. Gideon made a sound that was not quite a word. It was more of a controlled exhale through gritted teeth, the sound of a man whose patience had been tested to its molecular limit. I am going to board up every suit of armor, every chandelier, and every breakable surface in this castle, he said very calmly. And then I am going to kiss you. And nothing is going to fall, crash, howl, or explode. I was laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. Is that a royal decree? Consider it an executive order. I'll believe it when I see it. He looked at me, and his expression was so full of frustrated adoration that it was almost better than a kiss. Almost. We'd get there. We both knew it. The castle was just going to have to cooperate. The castle cooperated on a Thursday. It was early morning, the hour when the light came through the cleaned windows of the east wing at exactly the right angle and turned everything gold. I was making a final inspection of the finished guest rooms, checking details, making notes. The east wing was done. The whole project was nearly done. Another week, maybe 2, and I would have no professional reason to be here. Gideon was leaning in the doorway of the last guest room, watching me work. He did that openly now. No pretense of inspecting stonework, no excuses about security reviews. He just watched, and I let him, and it was warm and comfortable and ours. This room is beautiful, he said. It's adequate. The crown molding needs attention, and whoever installed the baseboard in the bathroom should be spoken to sternly. The crown molding is perfect, you just don't know how to stop. I turned to argue, and he was right there. Close. He'd moved silently, of course he had, and he was standing in the golden light with that expression, the one that was just him. No crown, no wolf, just the man who made my tea. No interruptions, he said softly, glancing around with exaggerated caution. Callum is in school. Marcus is in the East Tower. I checked. You scouted the perimeter for a kiss? I am a military strategist. I plan campaigns. The most powerful shifter in 500 miles, defeated by a 14-year-old and a suit of armor. Repeatedly. It has been deeply humiliating. I would like to reclaim some dignity. I smiled. He smiled. And then he kissed me. It was unhurried and warm and exactly right. It tasted like good coffee and patience, and the specific, stubborn sweetness of a man who had waited and waited and waited because he'd wanted me to choose him, and I had, and this was what choosing felt like. His hand cradled the back of my head. My fingers curled into the front of his sweater. The golden light poured through the windows of the room I'd made beautiful, and for a long moment, the castle was perfectly, gloriously silent. When we finally pulled apart, His forehead rested against mine. His eyes were closed. His wolf. I couldn't feel it. I never would. But I could see its effect. The slight tremor in his hands, the catch in his breathing. The way he held me like I was the first good thing to happen to him in his entire life. "This is not a Bond thing," I said quietly. "No? No, this is a me thing. I'm choosing this. I want you to know that." He opened his eyes. They were gray and gold and full. "I know," he said. And from the way he said it, I believed he finally did. From somewhere deep in the castle, very faintly, we heard a crash. Distant, muffled. Probably Callum. Gideon didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He just sighed against my lips, and I started laughing. And he kissed me again through the laughter, and the castle creaked and groaned around us like an old, enormous animal, settling into a shape it had forgotten it could be. 6 months later, Blackwood Manor was unrecognizable. The grave soil brown and dignified shadow had been vanquished, replaced by a palette of warm creams, serene blues, and cheerful yellows. Sunlight, no longer afraid, streamed through sparkling clean windows, illuminating rooms filled with comfortable furniture, soft rugs, and vibrant art. Wolves napped on the new couches, in fur, because that battle I'd conceded. But they did it gently, and nobody shredded anything, and I considered that a victory. The breakfast nook was a lemon-wallpapered sanctuary. The ballroom glittered in sapphire and silver. The courtyard jasmine had climbed 3 stories and smelled like heaven. It was no longer a fortress. It was a home. My home, though I still kept my business running. 3 new clients since the Blackwood contract had closed. All of them referrals from visiting alphas who'd seen the ballroom and decided their own pack houses needed help. Bryn Larson, decorator to the wolves. It wasn't the LinkedIn headline I'd imagined, but it paid well, and nobody had shredded my wallpaper in months. Gideon was in the middle of a meeting in his study with the alphas of the Silver Creek and Granite Peak packs. Important negotiations, serious business. Behind him, I was directing 2 wolves, in human form, I'd insisted, after the furniture incident of month 3, as they attempted to hang a massive abstract painting. "A little to the left," I instructed. "No, my left." Gideon cleared his throat, trying to maintain diplomatic gravitas. As I was saying, the tariffs on... He lost his train of thought as the painting went up another foot. He shot me a look over his shoulder, meant to be stern, utterly ruined by the warmth in his eyes. I winked. Marcus, standing by the door, shook his head. The smile on his face was the smile of a man who had spent his whole life watching his best friend carry the weight of the crown alone, and was now watching him carry it with someone who made him laugh. That evening, Gideon found me in the finished ballroom. I was standing in the center of the room, just taking it all in. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, and the warmth of him, always warm, always running a few degrees above human, settled around me like a second skin. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "It was always beautiful," I said, leaning back against him. "It just needed someone to let the light in." He pressed a kiss to my temple, and I felt him smile against my hair. His thumb brushed absently across the mark at the base of my neck, the small, silvered scar where his teeth had broken skin, on a night I remembered in vivid, specific detail, and had no intention of sharing with anyone except possibly Marcus, who already knew, because apparently wolves could smell everything, and privacy was a concept this pack was still working on. I couldn't feel the bond the way he could. I never would. But I could feel him, his warmth, his steadiness, the way his breathing changed when I was close. And sometimes, in quiet moments like this, I felt something else. A low, settled hum in my chest, like a frequency I'd tuned into without realizing. Not supernatural, just the specific, irreplaceable feeling of being exactly where I belonged. "I should tell you," he said, his voice low and amused. "Callum knocked over the new hall table this morning. Was anything broken?" "Just the vase." "Which vase?" "The ugly blue one. The replacement for the one I broke the day you arrived." I started laughing. That vase was hideous. I know. I think Callum is doing us a service at this point. From somewhere in the castle, right on cue, a distant crash echoed through the halls, followed by a young voice calling, "That one was already broken!" Gideon sighed. I laughed. The castle creaked and settled around us, ancient, enormous, no longer gloomy, and finally, unmistakably, home.